Tase him, tase him, tase him. Get your hands behind your back. Get your hands behind your back. Get your hands behind your back. Get your hands behind your back.
The first seconds of any police encounter establish a trajectory. They determine whether an interaction will resolve peacefully or spiral into violence. In Phoenix, Arizona on August 19, 2024, that trajectory was set before a single word could be exchanged, before a single word could even be heard. What unfolds in this body cam footage is not merely an aggressive arrest. It is a systematic failure of procedure, judgment, and basic human recognition, compressed into minutes that would alter a man's life and expose fractures in an institution meant to protect him. The call that brought officers Benjamin Harris and Kyle Sue to the Circle K convenience store had nothing to do with Tyrone McAlpin. The 911 request concerned a white male named Derek who was behaving aggressively and refusing to leave the premises. This is the foundational fact that everything else builds upon. The officers arrived to address a complaint about Derek. They spoke with Derek, and then, in a pivot that defies standard investigative practice, they abandoned the subject of the complaint entirely and pursued a different individual. A black man walking away from the store, FaceTiming with his wife, posing no visible threat to anyone. The decision-making process that led to this pivot deserves granular examination. When officers arrive at a disturbance call, protocol dictates that they assess the situation, identify the parties involved, gather statements, and determine the appropriate course of action regarding the individual about whom the complaint was made. Derek was that individual. He was present. He was accessible. He was, by the very nature of the call, the reason law enforcement was summoned. Yet within moments of speaking with him, officers Harris and Sue made a calculation that would prove catastrophic. Derek claimed that the black man walking away had tried to steal his bike and had punched him. This claim was unverified. No witnesses inside the store were consulted. No video evidence was reviewed. No attempt was made to corroborate or challenge Derek's account. The officers simply accepted the word of the man about whom someone had called 911 to complain, and they redirected their attention accordingly. The investigative shortcut embedded in this decision reveals a pattern familiar to those who study police encounters. The presumption of credibility granted to certain accusers, and the presumption of guilt assigned to certain accused. What makes this particularly striking is the context. The officers were called to handle Derek because he was being aggressive. This was the documented reason for their presence. Yet when Derek pointed at a black man and made an accusation, the officers did not pause to consider whether the aggressive individual they were sent to manage might be unreliable. They did not weigh the possibility that Derek's account was distorted, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated. They absorbed his claim and acted upon it immediately. This is where the concept of reasonable suspicion becomes relevant. Under the Fourth Amendment, officers must possess reasonable suspicion of criminal activity before initiating an investigative stop. Reasonable suspicion requires specific, articulable facts that would lead a reasonable person to believe criminal activity is occurring or has occurred. An uncorroborated accusation from the very person who was the subject of a disturbance call does not meet this threshold. It represents, at best, a starting point for further inquiry. At worst, it represents exactly what it became in this case: the pretext for immediate physical confrontation. The officers drove to the opposite side of the convenience store where Tyrone McAlpin was walking. He was on the phone with his wife, engaged in a video call using sign language, a detail that would become devastating in retrospect. As the patrol vehicle approached, McAlpin could not hear its engine, could not hear any verbal commands, could not process any auditory information whatsoever. He was deaf. He had been deaf his entire life. His world operated through visual and tactile channels, not auditory ones, and the officers approaching him had no idea. But here is where the analysis must deepen. The officers had no idea because they made no effort to discover it. They did not approach McAlpin with the caution and information gathering that a proper investigative stop requires. They did not attempt to establish communication before physical contact. They did not assess whether the individual they were approaching could hear them. Officer Harris jumped out of the vehicle and immediately closed distance with an apparent intention to control through force. The body camera footage shows what happened next with clinical clarity. McAlpin, unable to hear the approaching officer, unable to process the shouted commands, reacted to sudden physical contact from a stranger in the only way a person in that situation could, with confusion, with instinct, with an attempt to protect himself from an unexplained assault. To Officer Harris, whose perspective was shaped by the unverified claim from Derek, and whose approach had been aggressive from the start, this reaction registered as resistance. The escalation became immediate. The shouts of "tase him, tase him, tase him," captured in the opening moments of the footage, represent the complete abandonment of proportionality. A man who had not been told why he was being contacted, who could not have heard such an explanation even if it had been offered, who had no opportunity to comply with commands he could not perceive, was subjected to electrical weapon deployment within seconds of the encounter beginning. The taser was not a last resort. It was not preceded by attempts at verbal de-escalation. It was not justified by any weapon displayed by McAlpin or any threat articulated beyond his reflexive movements. It was deployed because officers had already decided that this encounter would be resolved through force. The repeated commands to place hands behind the back echo through the footage like a grim refrain. Over and over, the officers shouted instructions that McAlpin could not hear, and over they interpreted his failure to comply as willful resistance. This is the cruelest irony embedded in the encounter. Every shout was proof of the officer's failure to recognize the situation. Every ignored command was evidence not of defiance but of disability. And yet each perceived act of non-compliance justified, in the officers' minds, the continued application of force. When the second officer arrived on scene, the opportunity for de-escalation presented itself again. A fresh perspective, a moment of distance from the initial adrenaline-fueled confrontation, could have allowed for reassessment. Instead, Officer Sue joined the violence. The footage shows him participating in the restraint, contributing to the physical control of a man who was already on the ground, already overwhelmed, already incapable of understanding, what was being demanded of him. The concept of force multiplication applies here in its most troubling form. Two officers, physically dominant, armed, operating with the institutional authority of the state, focus their combined capacity for violence on a single disabled individual who had committed no crime and who could not have complied with their demands, even if he had wanted to. The disparity in power was absolute. The disparity in understanding was total, and the disparity in consequences would prove severe. During the restraint, officers demanded repeatedly that McAlpin put his hands behind his back. They struck him, they tasered him, they applied body weight to keep him prone. At no point during these early moments did they pause to consider why this individual was not responding verbally, why he was not acknowledging their commands, why his behavior might indicate something other than criminal resistance. The possibility that they were dealing with a medical situation, a cognitive difference, a sensory limitation. None of these considerations penetrated the tactical focus of the encounter. This is where institutional training meets individual judgment, and where both failed catastrophically. Officers are trained to recognize signs of medical distress, mental health crisis, and disability. They are trained to understand that non-compliance can have explanations beyond willful resistance. They are trained to adjust their approach when circumstances suggest that standard procedures may be inappropriate or counterproductive. Yet in this encounter, training yielded to momentum. The decision to approach with force created a trajectory that neither officer was willing or able to alter. The CCTV footage from the convenience store provides an external perspective on what the body cameras captured from within. It shows Officer Harris driving directly toward McAlpin, exiting the vehicle with evident urgency, closing physical distance immediately, and initiating contact in a manner that communicated confrontation rather than inquiry. From McAlpin's perspective, to the extent we can reconstruct it, a stranger in uniform appeared suddenly, moved aggressively toward him, and began grabbing and striking without explanation. His response was not criminal, it was human. The cerebral palsy that McAlpin lives with adds another layer to this analysis. Cerebral palsy affects motor control, coordination, and muscle function. It can make physical movements difficult, unpredictable, or impossible to execute on command. When officers demanded that McAlpin place his hands behind his back, they were issuing an instruction that his body may not have been capable of following smoothly even under ideal circumstances. Under the stress of a violent confrontation with electrical current disrupting his nervous system, with blows landing on his body, the expectation that he could perform precise motor tasks was medically unreasonable. But the officers did not know about the cerebral palsy in those first moments, just as they did not know about the deafness. They did not know because they did not ask. They did not assess. They did not observe. They operated from assumption, and their assumptions were shaped by the accusation from Derek and by whatever preconceptions they carried into the encounter. The result was a violent arrest of a man whose only actions were walking home while talking to his wife. The preliminary elements of this case establish a clear pattern. Assumptions substituted for investigation, force substituted for communication, and escalation substituted for de-escalation. Every choice officers made in the first 60 seconds of this encounter moved the situation toward violence. Every opportunity to pause, to assess, to reconsider was bypassed in favor of continued aggression. And when the physical confrontation was underway, the institutional mechanisms that might have intervened, backup officers, supervisory oversight, departmental protocol, served only to reinforce rather than correct the trajectory that had been established. The command structure visible in the footage reveals how dysfunction compounds. When additional units arrived, They encountered a scene where violence was already in progress. They saw fellow officers engaged in restraining a prone individual. They absorbed the framing that the officers on scene had established. This is a suspect. This is resistance. This is a threat requiring control. The opportunity for an outside perspective to recognize the abnormality of the situation, the silence of the suspect, the confusion rather than aggression in his movements, the medical indicators that something was wrong, was lost to institutional solidarity and tactical momentum. This is how systems fail, not through a single catastrophic decision, but through a cascade of smaller choices, each one reinforcing the ones that came before, each one making the eventual outcome more inevitable. The officers who beat and tasered Tyrone McAlpin did not set out that morning to brutalize a deaf man with cerebral palsy. They set out to respond to a disturbance call, but the assumptions they carried, the procedures they bypassed, the judgments they made in the space of seconds, created an outcome that no reasonable policy could endorse and no honest assessment could defend. When Jessica McAlpin arrived at the scene where her husband lay restrained on the ground, she brought with her the one thing that could have ended the violence immediately: information. She knew that Tyrone was deaf. She knew that he had cerebral palsy. She knew that he had been on the phone with her, using sign language, when the officers approached. She knew that whatever the officers believed had happened was fundamentally disconnected from reality. And she attempted to communicate this information clearly, calmly, and repeatedly. That the officers' response to her presence constitutes its own category of failure. The footage captures the moment when she identifies herself as McAlpin's wife and attempts to explain his disabilities. She states that he is deaf. She states that he has cerebral palsy. She explains that he was on the phone with her using sign language, which is why he was holding his phone. She provides, in other words, every piece of information necessary for the officers to understand that they had made a catastrophic error. The response she receives is dismissal, disbelief, and threat. Officer Harris's reaction to the information that McAlpin is deaf reveals a particular kind of institutional blindness. His question, "How can he be deaf if you've been on the phone with him?" demonstrates an unfamiliarity with basic assistive technology and communication methods that is troubling in any law enforcement context. Video relay services, video phone applications, and sign language communication have existed for decades. They are not obscure technologies. They are standard accommodations used by millions of deaf individuals to communicate across distance. An officer who doesn't know that deaf people can use phones has not received adequate training in disability awareness. An officer who expresses that ignorance while standing over a man he has just beaten and tasered has demonstrated a gap in knowledge with life-altering consequences. But the deeper problem is not the officer's unfamiliarity with technology. It is his unwillingness to accept information that contradicted his existing narrative. By the time Jessica McAlpin arrived, the officers had already committed to a version of events in which her husband was a criminal suspect who had resisted arrest. Accepting her explanation would have required acknowledging that they had attacked an innocent disabled man for no legitimate reason. The psychological barriers to such acknowledgement are substantial. Cognitive dissonance, defensive rationalization, institutional loyalty, all of these factors militate against officers admitting in the moment that they were wrong. and so the narrative held. When Jessica explained that her husband was deaf, the officers did not pause their activities to reassess. When she explained that he had cerebral palsy, they did not call for medical evaluation. When she explained that he had not assaulted anyone, that she had been on the phone with him the entire time, that the officers had approached the wrong person, they responded with a phrase that captures the arrogance of unchecked authority. Well, he did now. This phrase deserves examination. Well, he did now serves as a retroactive justification for violence. It acknowledges implicitly that whatever McAlpin may or may not have done before the officers approached is no longer relevant, because the officer's use of force during the encounter has created new charges. The suspected assault at the Circle K, which was never verified and would later prove false, had been superseded by the charge of assault on a police officer, a charge generated entirely by the officer's own aggressive approach to a disabled man who could not hear their commands. This is the machinery of self-justifying violence in its most transparent form. Officers approach an individual based on unverified accusations. They use force without establishing communication. The individual, unable to understand or comply, reacts reflexively. The officers interpret the reflexive reaction as resistance or assault. The original basis for the encounter becomes irrelevant because the encounter itself has produced the justification for arrest. The system generates its own evidence, validates its own actions, and criminalizes the person it victimized. Jessica McAlpin's attempts to advocate for her husband were met not only with dismissal, but with active threat. She was warned to stay behind a line on the sidewalk. She was told that crossing that line would result in her own arrest. The message was clear. The officers controlled this scene. They controlled the narrative, and any attempt to challenge their authority would be met with the same force they had applied to her husband. A woman attempting to help her disabled husband, providing information that could have prevented further harm, was reduced to the status of potential defendant simply by virtue of being present and speaking. The treatment of witnesses and family members during police encounters often reveals the true nature of the power dynamics at play. Officers who are confident in the legitimacy of their actions generally welcome clarifying information. Officers who recognize that they may have made errors sometimes become receptive to correction, but officers who have committed serious violations often respond to witnesses with hostility precisely because those witnesses represent threats to the narrative they are constructing. Jessica McAlpin was not treated as a source of valuable information. She was treated as an obstacle. Meanwhile, on the ground, Tyrone McAlpin remained silent. Throughout the entire encounter captured in the footage, he does not speak a word. This silence is not defiance. It is not the strategic silence of a suspect protecting his rights. It is the silence of a deaf man who communicates through sign language and who, even if he wanted to speak, was being physically restrained, beaten, and tasered. His silence should have been a signal. In any reasonable assessment of the encounter, the complete absence of verbal response from the person being arrested should have prompted officers to consider alternative explanations. Instead, it was interpreted through the lens they had already adopted. This is a suspect. This is resistance. This silence is evidence of guilt or stubbornness rather than disability. When medical personnel finally arrived, the scene they encountered was revealing. McAlpin required an oxygen mask to breathe properly. He had been subjected to multiple taser deployments. He had been struck repeatedly. He had been restrained on the ground by the weight of 2 officers. The medical needs were apparent and urgent. Yet the body camera footage shows that the officers' primary concern was not McAlpin's condition but their own. The discussion immediately following the violent restraint focused on one officer's injured hand and another officer's claim that McAlpin had bitten him. The victimizer had become, in the institutional framing, the victim. This inversion of harm is common in excessive force cases. Officers who inflict violence often report injuries sustained during the encounter. Bruised knuckles from punching, bites from subjects attempting to escape painful holds, strained muscles from restraining someone on the ground. These injuries are then documented, medicalized, and used as evidence of the subject's violent nature. The circular logic is complete. The officer injured himself while beating someone. Therefore, the person who was beaten is guilty of causing injury to an officer. The charge sheet that would eventually be filed against McAlpin reflected this logic perfectly. Aggravated assault on a police officer, resisting arrest. These charges arose entirely from the encounter itself, from McAlpin's reflexive attempts to protect himself from unexplained violence, from the movements his body made while officers struck him and applied electrical current. The original accusation from Derek, the theft and assault that had supposedly justified approaching McAlpin in the first place, faded into irrelevance. It had served its purpose. It had provided the pretext. The encounter itself had generated the real charges. The criminal justice system that processed these charges initially validated the officer's account. At the preliminary hearing, despite testimony that revealed the complete absence of proper procedure, despite evidence that McAlpin was deaf and had cerebral palsy, despite the clear indications that officers had failed to establish any communication before using force, the judge found probable cause to proceed. McAlpin, the victim of a violent attack, was now the defendant in a criminal case. The testimonies of Officers Harris and Sue during the preliminary hearing provide insight into the narrative's law enforcement constructs after the fact. When asked why he did not confirm Derek's story with witnesses inside the store, Officer Harris had no substantive answer. When asked whether he had checked if McAlpin had headphones in, a simple explanation for why someone might not respond to verbal commands, he admitted he had not noticed. When asked whether he had attempted to wave McAlpin down before using force, he confirmed he had not. The litany of investigative steps not taken, communication attempts not made, and alternatives not explored painted a picture of an officer who had decided upon confrontation before any assessment had occurred. Officer Harris's description of McAlpin raising his hands is particularly revealing. He testified that McAlpin raised his hands in a manner that appeared ready to strike. When asked to demonstrate, he showed a motion that could as easily be interpreted as defensive as aggressive. When pressed on whether McAlpin might have been raising his hands to protect himself from punches, Harris responded that it was not what his body language communicated to me. The interpretation was fixed. The possibility of alternative readings was dismissed. The narrative had calcified. Officer Sue's testimony regarding the chokehold was similarly instructive. The footage showed his arm around McAlpin's throat. When asked how this was not a chokehold, Sue responded that he thought of a chokehold as involving 2 arms from the same person. The technical distinction he was attempting to draw, whether one officer's arm around a throat constitutes a chokehold if another officer is also applying pressure, is the kind of post hoc rationalization that allows dangerous techniques to continue under different labels. The 24 days Tyrone McAlpin spent in jail before posting bail represent one of the concrete harms that can be quantified in this case. 24 days separated from his wife. 24 days away from his 6-month-old son. 24 days as an incarcerated person, subjected to the conditions and dangers of detention, because officers had attacked him without cause and because the initial judicial review had credited their account. The financial burden of bail, the psychological trauma of incarceration for an innocent person, the disruption to family and livelihood. These are the tangible costs of a system that failed at every level. The eventual dismissal of charges came not from within the system, but from external pressure. The Maricopa County Attorney, Rachel Mitchell, personally reviewed the body camera footage after public outcry began to build. The NAACP met with the Department of Justice. Disability rights organizations issued demands. State legislators called for the charges to be dropped. The governor's office expressed concern. It was this external pressure, this public attention, this political consequence that finally moved the system to acknowledge what was visible from the first moments of the footage. Tyrone McAlpin had committed no crime. But the dismissal of charges is not justice. It is the absence of continued injustice. It is the cessation of active harm. McAlpin had still been beaten. He had still been tasered. He had still spent 24 days in jail. He had still faced the terror of unexplained violence from agents of the state. He had still been transformed in official records and public perception from a man walking home to a criminal defendant. The dismissal erased the legal jeopardy, but it could not erase the experience. The statement from the Phoenix Police Department following the public backlash was notable for its blandness. The incident was the subject of an ongoing investigation and had been assigned to the Professional Standards Bureau, standard language for any use of force review. There was no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no expression of regret for the harm inflicted, no commitment to specific reforms. The institutional response was to absorb the criticism and continue operating. The case of Tyrone McAlpin is not an aberration. It is an expression of patterns so deeply embedded in American law enforcement that they recur with predictable regularity across departments, jurisdictions, and decades. The specific elements, the racial profiling, the failure to accommodate disability, the immediate resort to force, the circular generation of charges to justify the violence, the institutional protection of officers afterward, appear in case after case, investigation after investigation, reform effort after reform effort. Understanding why these patterns persist is essential to understanding why they continue to produce victims. The decision by Officers Harris and Sue to pursue Tyrone McAlpin, rather than address Derek, the man about whom the 911 call was actually made, reflects dynamics that have been documented extensively in studies of police behavior. Research consistently shows that officers make rapid assessments based on race, location, and appearance, and that these assessments influence every subsequent decision in an encounter. The term racial profiling captures only part of this phenomenon. What occurs is a comprehensive filtering of information through pre-existing frameworks that assign suspicion, credibility, and threat level before any individualized assessment takes place. Derek was white. He was the subject of a complaint for aggressive behavior. He remained at the scene when officers arrived. By any reasonable investigative standard, he was the person requiring attention. Yet when he pointed at a black man and made an accusation, the officer's attention shifted immediately. Derek was granted credibility. McAlpin was assigned suspicion. The transformation required no evidence, no verification, no investigation. It required only the accusation and the racial identities of the parties involved. This is not to suggest that Officers Harris and Sue consciously decided to pursue McAlpin because of his race. And the psychology of implicit bias operates below the level of conscious decision-making. Officers may genuinely believe they are treating all individuals equally, while their actions systematically produce disparate outcomes. The value of analyzing cases like this one is not to access the inner mental states of the officers involved, which are unknowable, but to examine the decisions they made and the outcomes those decisions produced. And those outcomes, in this case, followed patterns that have been documented so frequently that they constitute a recognized phenomenon in criminological research. The failure to accommodate McAlpin's disabilities compounds the racial dimension with an additional layer of systemic failure. And the Americans with Disabilities Act requires law enforcement to provide reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities. This requirement is not optional. It is not a matter of departmental policy subject to revision. It is federal civil rights law. Officers are required to recognize signs of disability, to adjust their approach accordingly, and to ensure that individuals with disabilities are not subjected to discrimination or unnecessary harm. The signs that McAlpin was disabled were present throughout the encounter for anyone prepared to observe them. He did not respond to verbal commands. He did not speak. His movements showed characteristics consistent with motor impairment. His wife explicitly informed officers of his deafness and cerebral palsy. Yet at no point did the officer's approach change. The taser continued to be deployed. The commands continued to be shouted. The physical restraint continued to be applied. The accommodation required by law was never provided because the officers were operating in a mode that did not include accommodation as a possibility. Training is often cited as the solution to failures like these. If only officers were better trained to recognize disability, the argument goes, they would respond appropriately. If only they received more instruction in de-escalation, they would pursue it. If only implicit bias training were more thorough, they would overcome their preconceptions. This faith in training is understandable but inadequate. The Phoenix Police Department, like departments across the country, provides training in all of these areas. Officers Harris and Sue had presumably completed such training. It did not prevent the outcome documented in the body camera footage. The reason training alone cannot solve these problems is that training operates within an institutional culture that determines how it is applied. If officers are trained to recognize disability but are also immersed in a culture that emphasizes command presence, rapid control, and the immediate suppression of any perceived resistance, the training on disability will be subordinated to the cultural imperatives. If officers are trained in de-escalation, but are evaluated, rewarded, and promoted based on metrics that do not include de-escalation outcomes, the training becomes theoretical rather than practical. Training without cultural change is information without implementation. The institutional culture of the Phoenix Police Department has been documented in reports that predate the McAlpin incident. The Department of Justice investigation found patterns of discrimination against individuals with behavioral health disabilities, excessive use of force, and systemic failures to provide appropriate accommodations. These findings were not secrets. They were official conclusions reached by federal investigators. Yet the patterns they identified continued, producing cases like McAlpin's months and years after the problems were formally recognized. This persistence of dysfunction despite identification is one of the most troubling aspects of police reform efforts. The problems are known, the solutions are understood, the reforms are announced, and yet the outcomes remain unchanged. The gap between policy and practice, between stated values and operational reality, endures because the incentive structures within police departments do not align with the reform objectives. Officers who use force rarely face meaningful consequences. Departments that generate misconduct findings rarely suffer institutional penalties. The costs of continued dysfunction are borne by victims, while the benefits of institutional solidarity are enjoyed by officers and administrators. Qualified immunity plays a crucial role in maintaining this dynamic. The legal doctrine that protects government officials from civil liability unless they violate clearly established constitutional rights has been interpreted so narrowly by courts that officers can avoid accountability even for egregious violations. The requirement that a prior case with nearly identical facts must exist before rights are considered clearly established creates a catch-22. Novel forms of misconduct cannot be punished because they are novel, and their novelty prevents them from becoming the precedent that would make future violations punishable. Officers Harris and Sue, as of the available information, were placed on paid administrative leave following the public outcry. Paid administrative leave is not discipline. It is paid time off during an investigation. Officers on paid administrative leave receive their full salary while being relieved of duty, a status that, from the officer's immediate perspective, may be indistinguishable from vacation. The investigation that follows may or may not result in meaningful consequences. History suggests that police internal investigations disproportionately conclude in favor of the officers being investigated, particularly when the department is not under sustained external pressure. The civil lawsuit that Tyrone McAlpin has filed represents one avenue for accountability. Civil litigation can impose financial costs on departments, generate public records through discovery, and force officers to testify under oath about their conduct. Settlements or verdicts can produce changes in policy and training. But civil litigation is not criminal accountability. Officers Harris and Sue haven't been charged with crimes. The violence they inflicted on a disabled man has not been treated as assault. The same system that charged McAlpin with aggravated assault for reflexively protecting himself has not applied the same theory of liability to officers who initiated violence against an innocent person. This asymmetry is not accidental. It reflects deliberate policy choices about who is protected and who is punished by the criminal justice system. Prosecutors work daily with police officers. They depend on officers for evidence, testimony, and cooperation in their cases. The institutional relationship creates reluctance to charge officers with crimes, even when the evidence would support such charges. The result is a two-tiered system in which civilians face criminal prosecution for conduct that, if committed by officers, generates at most administrative review. The role of prosecutors in the McAlpin case illustrates this dynamic. In the initial decision to file charges against McAlpin, despite the body camera footage, despite the evidence of disability, despite the complete absence of verified criminal conduct, was a prosecutorial choice. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office reviewed the case and decided it was appropriate to charge a deaf man with cerebral palsy for the crime of being beaten by police. Only after public outcry made the case politically untenable did the same office reverse course and dismiss the charges. The reversal indicates that the dismissal was available from the beginning. The initial charging decision was not compelled by evidence. It was a discretionary choice that prioritized the officer's account over the victim's reality. The fear that Jessica McAlpin described her husband experiencing, afraid to go outside, afraid to walk the streets of his own neighborhood, is a predictable consequence of what he endured. Trauma from police violence manifests in lasting psychological impacts: hypervigilance, anxiety, avoidance of public spaces, distrust of institutions. A man who was attacked for walking home while talking to his wife has received a visceral education in what can happen to him in public spaces. No subsequent dismissal of charges, no civil settlement, no departmental statement can undo that lesson. The demand for systemic reform following the McAlpin case joined a chorus of similar demands following similar cases. Governor Katie Hobbs called for more training for police across Arizona. Disability rights organizations submitted lists of demands. The NLACP engaged with the Department of Justice. And these responses are familiar because they recur with each high-profile incident. They represent the cycle of outrage and reform that has characterized American policing for decades without producing fundamental change. Breaking this cycle would require changes that are rarely implemented. Meaningful accountability for individual officers, including criminal prosecution where warranted, elimination of qualified immunity to enable civil liability, transformation of police union contracts to permit discipline, civilian oversight with genuine authority, restructuring of incentive systems within departments, and sustained political will to overcome institutional resistance. Each of these changes faces substantial obstacles. Police unions are politically powerful. Qualified immunity is protected by courts invested in preserving it. Civilian oversight is often structured to be ineffective. Political will dissipates as public attention moves on. The footage of what happened to Tyrone McAlpin documents a chain of failures so complete that it seems almost designed to produce the outcome it did. An unverified accusation is treated as truth. A black man is pursued while the white complainant is left unaddressed. An approach without communication is immediately escalated to force. A deaf man is shouted at and punished for not responding. A man with cerebral palsy is demanded to perform physical tasks and beaten for not complying. A wife who provides exculpatory information is dismissed and threatened. A victim is charged as a criminal. An institution closes ranks around those who did harm. Every element in this chain represents a choice. Each choice was made by individuals operating within systems that rewarded or permitted those choices. The tragedy is not that the system broke down. The tragedy is that the system functioned exactly as it was designed to function and produced suffering as a result. Tyrone McAlpin survived his encounter with the Phoenix Police Department. He will carry its consequences for the remainder of his life. His case has joined the collection of documented incidents that demonstrate what is possible when power is unchecked by accountability. Whether his case produces lasting change or becomes another entry in a catalog of abuses that continue uncorrected will depend on factors beyond any individual's control: political will, institutional resistance, public attention, and the capacity of systems to reform themselves when reform threatens those who benefit from the status quo. The body camera footage preserves the evidence. It shows what happened. What happens next is a question that remains open and that will be answered not by the footage itself, but by the institutions and individuals who must decide whether to treat it as an occasion for change or another moment to be absorbed and survived.